The heat shimmered off the asphalt, a relentless, wavering ghost dancing on the horizon. Owen's old pickup truck rumbled along the empty stretch of desert highway, the engine a familiar, comforting growl against the vast silence. In the passenger seat, his daughter Pippa's head bobbed with the rhythm of the road, her small hand clutching a worn stuffed bunny. He glanced at her, a fierce, protective love swelling in his chest. She was his world, his reason for breathing, the steady beat in the quiet symphony of their life. It was then that he saw it, a smudge of color against the endless beige, a place where the shimmering air seemed to coalesce into something solid. He squinted, his foot easing off the gas. It wasn't a tumbleweed or a trick of the light. It was a person. He pulled over, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder, and a cloud of dust billowed behind them. "Stay here, sweet pea," he murmured, his voice calm despite the sudden knot in his stomach. He opened the driver's side door, and the oppressive heat washed over him like a physical blow. Walking toward the still figure, he could see it was a woman, sprawled beside a ridiculously inadequate designer suitcase, its leather scuffed and torn. Her clothes were expensive but wilted, her face pale beneath a layer of dust and grime. He knelt beside her, his mechanic's hands, usually stained with grease, surprisingly gentle as he felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, thready but persistent. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow. He ran back to the truck, grabbing the large water jug he always kept for emergencies. Pippa watched him with wide, solemn eyes, her bunny held tight to her chest. He returned to the woman, carefully lifting her head and trickling a small amount of water onto her lips. She stirred, a low moan escaping her. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of a stormy sea, confused and frightened. "It's okay," Owen said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe. I've got you." He scooped her up. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp angles and fragile bones. As he carried her back to the truck, she seemed to drift back into unconsciousness, her head resting against his shoulder with a sigh of surrender. He settled her into the front seat, buckling her in carefully before climbing back behind the wheel. The question hung in the superheated air of the cab: who was she, and what terrible story had left her to die in the middle of nowhere? He drove her to the only place he could, home. It was a small, sun-bleached house attached to the auto repair shop he owned and operated, a lonely outpost of civilization against the sprawling desert. The sign, Miller & Son Auto Repair, was faded, the and son a monument to a father long gone and a life he was trying to build for his own child. He carried the woman inside, the scent of dust and desperation clinging to her. The house was modest, the furniture worn but clean, every surface reflecting the quiet order of a life lived with intention and little excess. He laid her down on Pippa's bed, the only spare one they had, and his daughter followed him in, her small face a mask of concern. Without a word, Pippa placed her stuffed bunny beside the woman's head, a silent offering of comfort. Owen gently wiped the woman's face with a cool, damp cloth. As he worked, he noticed the fine lines of her cheekbones, the delicate arch of her brows. There was a refinement to her, a stark contrast to his own rough-hewn existence. She woke hours later, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar room, landing on the hand-drawn pictures of smiling sons and stick-figure families taped to the wall. Fear tightened her expression. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raspy. Owen, who had been sitting in a chair in the corner, stood up slowly. "You're at my house. Just outside of Harmony Creek. I found you on the highway." He offered her a glass of water, and she drank it greedily. "I'm Owen. This is my daughter, Pippa." Pippa gave a small, shy wave. The woman didn't offer her own name, her gaze still wary, guarded. She was like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He didn't press. He simply brought her a bowl of soup, its steam carrying the humble scent of home and safety. He knew what it was to be broken by the world, and he understood that sometimes, the greatest kindness was silence. He left the door ajar, a silent promise that she was not a prisoner, that the way out was as open as the way in had been. Days bled into one another under the vast, cerulean sky. The woman, who eventually offered the name Clara, began to recover her strength. She spoke little of her past, weaving a vague and brittle narrative about escaping a controlling family and a future that felt like a gilded cage. Owen accepted her story without question. He recognized the haunted look in her eyes. It was a different ghost than the one he carried, but a ghost nonetheless. He saw his own grief for his late wife, Sarah, reflected in Clara's profound loneliness. He never spoke of Sarah directly, but her presence was a gentle echo in the house. It was in the single coffee mug he left out on the counter each morning, a habit he couldn't break. It was in the way he'd softly hum a tune while fixing Pippa's bicycle, a song Sarah had loved. Pippa, with the unfiltered wisdom of a child, became the bridge between them. One afternoon, she tugged on Clara's hand and led her to a small, framed photo on the mantelpiece. It showed Owen, younger and smiling, with his arm around a woman with kind eyes and a radiant laugh. Pippa pointed. "That's my mommy. She's an angel now." Clara's carefully constructed walls seemed to crack. She knelt, her gaze softening as she looked at the picture. She was beautiful, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't hide. Later that day, Pippa presented Clara with a new drawing. It depicted 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long, dark hair. "That's you," Pippa said, pointing to the new figure. "Now we're a new family." A tear escaped Clara's eye, a single, hot drop that traced a clean path through the dust of her old life. For the first time since she'd woken up in this strange, quiet house, she felt a flicker of something she'd long forgotten: hope. She was beginning to understand that safety wasn't about locked gates and security systems, it was about the steadfast kindness in a stranger's eyes. Slowly, tentatively, Clara began to inhabit the space around her. The helplessness she'd felt in the desert was replaced by a burgeoning sense of purpose. She had never cooked a meal, cleaned a bathroom, or fixed anything in her life. Her existence had been one of passive reception, of being managed and curated. Here, she learned the satisfying rhythm of simple work. She helped Owen in the garden, a small, stubborn patch of green he coaxed from the dry earth. She felt the rough texture of the soil under her fingernails and discovered the quiet miracle of a tomato ripening on the vine. She read stories to Pippa, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each turned page. She found herself laughing, a real, unburdened sound that surprised them both. She watched Owen in his garage, a sanctuary of steel and oil. He moved with a quiet competence, his hands transforming broken machinery into functioning art. He treated every customer with the same gruff but profound respect, whether they were a wealthy tourist in a broken-down luxury car or a local farmer with a failing tractor. He was a man of deep, unshowy integrity. One evening, as they stood side by side washing dishes, the setting sun painting the kitchen in hues of orange and rose, their hands brushed in the warm, soapy water. A current, gentle but unmistakable, passed between them. Clara looked up, her stormy eyes meeting his steady brown ones. In that shared glance, a silent conversation unfolded. They were two people from different worlds, scarred by loss and bound by a shared desire for peace. The chasm between a runaway heiress and a desert mechanic seemed to shrink, filled by a growing, unspoken affection. She was no longer just a woman he had rescued, she was becoming a part of the fragile, beautiful life he had built from scratch. And for him, she was a whisper of a second chance he never thought he'd deserve. The quiet house no longer felt like it was echoing with loss, it was starting to fill with the soft hum of a new beginning. The fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday. Clara was folding laundry, the scent of sun-dried cotton a simple pleasure, while Pippa napped in her room. The small television in the corner was on, tuned to a national news channel. A report on the global financial markets began, and a familiar face filled the screen. It was a man with a face like carved granite and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. The Chiron beneath him read, Alastair Covington on his corporation's record profits. Clara froze, a half-folded t-shirt slipping from her grasp. Her father. The sound of his voice, a clipped, arrogant baritone that had dictated every moment of her life, filled the small room. A wave of nausea and panic washed over her. She lunged for the remote, fumbling with the buttons, and silenced the television just as Owen walked in, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He saw the stark terror on her face, the way her skin had gone ashen. "Everything all right?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Fine," she choked out, forcing a brittle smile. Just a bad memory." The lie felt like broken glass in her throat. He didn't push, but the worry in his eyes remained. The shadow of her past, once a distant specter, now felt chillingly close. A few days later, her fears were amplified. While watering the tomato plants, she saw a sleek black sedan, its windows darkly tinted, cruise slowly down their long, dusty driveway. It didn't stop, just paused for a moment, an ominous, silent observer, before accelerating away, leaving a plume of dust in its wake. It was a car from her father's security fleet. They had found her. The sanctuary Owen had built was no longer safe. The desert, which had almost killed her, now felt like the only place she had ever been free. Every rumble of a passing car on the distant highway made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew it was only a matter of time before the gilded cage she had escaped came to reclaim her. The inevitable arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, menacing crunch of expensive tires on cheap gravel. Two black SUVs, identical to the one she had seen before, pulled up in front of the garage, blocking the entrance. Men in impeccably tailored suits emerged, their faces impassive, their posture radiating a quiet authority that was more intimidating than any weapon. And then, Alastair Covington stepped out of the rear vehicle. He was dressed in a bespoke suit that seemed to repel the dust and heat of the desert. His presence was an immediate, oppressive force, a pocket of cold air in the sweltering afternoon. He scanned the humble property with an expression of profound disdain before his eyes landed on Clara, who stood frozen by the front door. He didn't so much as glance at Owen, who had come out of the garage, a wrench still in his hand. "Clarissa," Alastair said, his voice void of any warmth, any fatherly affection. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a failing asset. "This foolish little game is over. You will come home now." The command was absolute, leaving no room for argument. Owen stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between Alastair and Clara. He wasn't a large man, but his stance was solid, immovable. "Sir, I think you should leave," he said, his voice low and even. For the first time, Alastair Covington deigned to look at him. His eyes swept over Owen's grease-stained shirt and worn work boots, and a small, cruel smile touched his lips. "You," he said, the word dripping with contempt, "have no idea who you're talking to, grease monkey." "Step aside," but Owen didn't move. He was the only thing standing between Clara and the life that had nearly suffocated her, a simple, steadfast wall against an invading army. The desert air grew heavy, charged with the impending collision of two worlds that were never meant to touch. "She is Clarissa Covington," Alastair announced, his voice booming with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. He gestured dismissively toward Owen. "My daughter. And you, I can only assume, are the opportunist who thought you'd hit the jackpot." He painted a swift, brutal picture for his men, for the desert, for the world, his emotionally fragile daughter, having a breakdown, falling into the clutches of a backwater mechanic looking for a payday. The words were designed to humiliate, to strip Owen of his dignity and Clara of her agency. "I am, however, a reasonable man," Alastair continued, pulling a sleek leather wallet from his jacket. "Let's call this a finder's fee. For your trouble," he spoke directly to Owen now, his eyes like chips of ice. $100,000. A wire transfer. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement, walk away, and forget you ever saw her. It's more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes of fixing rusted scrap heaps." The offer hung in the air, a vulgar and tempting poison. $100,000. It was a life-changing sum. It could fix the leaking roof, replace his failing truck, and build a college fund for Pippa that would guarantee her a future far from this dusty patch of land. It was the ultimate moral test, laid bare under the unforgiving sun. Owen looked at the billionaire, a man who saw the world as a series of transactions, and then he looked at Clara, who stood behind him, trembling, her face a mask of despair. He saw not an heiress or a lottery ticket, but a woman who had learned to laugh again in his kitchen. He saw the person who read stories to his daughter and who held his hand while they watched the sunset. He thought of Sarah, and the simple, profound love they had shared, a treasure no amount of money could ever buy. A strength, fierce and defiant, surged through Clara. She stepped out from behind Owen, her chin held high. "He saved my life, father," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He showed me more kindness in a week than you have in my entire life." She moved to stand beside Owen, her small hand finding his, her fingers lacing through his calloused ones. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration of war. "I'm not going back to that life. I'm staying here." Alastair's face, already a cold mask, seemed to harden further, cracking into something truly malevolent. "Then you will have nothing," he hissed. "Every account will be frozen. Every privilege revoked. You will be cut off, penniless." His gaze shifted to Owen, his eyes narrowing with venom. "And I will ruin this man. I will bury him in lawsuits so frivolous he'll spend the rest of his pathetic life paying off the debt. I will call social services and have them investigate a father who brings strange, unstable women into his child's home. I will see to it he loses custody for endangering her." The threat was monstrous, aimed at the very heart of Owen's world. Just then, the screen door creaked open. Pippa, woken by the raised voices, stood in the doorway, her bunny clutched in her arms, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She took in the scene, the big, dark cars, the angry men in suits, and her father standing like a sentinel. She ran to Owen, wrapping her small arms around his leg, a tiny anchor in a raging storm. Then she looked up at Clara, her lower lip trembling. "Don't let the mean men take you," she whispered, her voice a pure, piercing note of truth. That simple, heartfelt plea cut through all the threats and manipulations, crystallizing the moment into a single, undeniable choice. "You can't buy this," Owen said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He squeezed Clara's hand, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. "You can't threaten it, and you can't possibly understand it." He looked Alistair Covington directly in the eye, men to men, no longer a mechanic to a billionaire, but a father protecting his own. "This is my family. My daughter. And Clara is part of it now, if she wants to be." Clara's grip on his hand tightened. "I do," she whispered, the words a sacred vow. Owen nodded once, a final, resolute gesture. "We don't want your money," he told Alistair. "We just want you to leave." Now, for the first time in his life, Alistair Covington was defeated. He had come with an army of wealth and power, expecting to crush this insignificant man, but he had run headlong into a fortress of integrity he could not breach. There was no price, no threat, that could touch what these people had. He sputtered, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He issued more empty threats, his words losing their power with each repetition. Finally, utterly neutered, he turned and stalked back to his SUV, barking orders at his silent men. As the door slammed shut, one of the younger security guards, a man who had stood by and watched the entire exchange, caught Owen's eye. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of respect before climbing into the vehicle. The SUVs roared to life, turned around, and sped away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence. The oppressive weight was gone. Owen knelt, pulling Pippa into a fierce hug. Clara knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around them both, her tears finally falling, not in sorrow, but in overwhelming relief and gratitude. They were a tiny island of love in the vast, indifferent desert, and they had won. Weeks later, the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively. The echoes of Alistair Covington's threats had faded, replaced by the familiar, comforting sounds of life. Clara, using a small trust her mother had left her, one her father couldn't control, had hired a lawyer who sent a firm, unequivocal letter that put an end to any potential harassment. They didn't hear from him again. They didn't need his money or his world. They were building their own. The final scene of their struggle was not one of drama, but of quiet creation. The three of them were in the small patch of earth behind the house, the late afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows. They were planting a garden. Owen, his hands dark with rich soil, showed Clara how to gently cup a tomato seedling, how to settle it into its new home. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now smudged with dirt, and she had never looked more beautiful. Pippa, in charge of the watering can, moved with a child's solemn purpose, giving each new plant a careful drink. The air was warm, filled with the scent of earth and the promise of growth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of gold and purple, Clara leaned her head against Owen's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They watched Pippa chase a firefly, her laughter a bright, tinkling melody in the twilight. They weren't a billionaire and his heiress. They were a family, their roots finally taking hold in the warm, accepting soil of a life they had chosen, a life they had fought for. They had found their fortune not in a locked vault or a stock portfolio, but right here, in the middle of the desert, under a vast and loving sky. It was a treasure beyond price.